Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me again on IAmFat. This week I'm going to be talking about the historical moment for the United Kingdom, which is also known as Brexit. So as many of you know, on Thursday, June 23rd, so this past Thursday, a referendum was held to decide whether the United Kingdom should leave or remain in the European Union. And the Leave vote obviously won. It won by a 52% to a 48% stay vote, with more than 30 million people voting on the referendum, which is the highest turnout in a UK-wide vote since the 1992 general election. So this is pretty big news. And the numbers relating to the vote are really telling. According to referendum results from the United Kingdom Census Office and the Press Association, high numbers of Leave votes came from people who fell into the low-income bracket or who didn't currently hold a valid passport, which meant that they had not recently traveled abroad. And high numbers of stay votes, unsurprisingly, came from those who had a degree or were currently in an occupation that required a degree education. A more notable and possibly the most important area is the demographic relating to age. Overwhelmingly, those in the younger generation, although there was very few of them, voted to stay, while those in the older generation voted to leave. And because Flurt is a youth-oriented, socially conscious magazine, I'm of course going to be talking about why the European Union was so important to youth enough that they all wanted to stay. But first we have to talk about what the European Union actually is and why it mattered so much to the youth in the UK that the referendum voted a stay. So let's find out. So the European Union, which is also known as the EU, is an economic and political partnership that involves 28 European countries. It was formed after the Second World War to foster economic cooperation, with the idea being that countries that trade together are more likely to avoid going to war with each other. One of the biggest components of the EU is its single market, which essentially allows goods and services and people to move around as if they were in one country. It even has its own currency, the euro, which operates in 19 countries, and it also has its own parliament, its own sets of rules, and a variety of areas, which, interestingly enough, includes mobile phone charges. Who knew? And UK joined in, I think, 1973 or 1975, somewhere around there, and it's also the first member country to ever leave the European Union, so this is a really big deal. The question now is, why did this referendum even happen? According to an article by the BBC, the UK Independence Party, which won the last European elections, campaigned for Britain's exit from the EU. It was backed by about half of the Conservative MPs, which included 5 cabinet ministers, several Labour MPs, and the DUP. Those in support of leaving claimed that Britain was being held back by the EU because it imposed too many rules on business, and it also charged billions of pounds a year in membership fees for what they saw as little in return. They also wanted full control of British borders and to reduce the number of immigrants to the UK. Again, unsurprising that immigration would come up, especially because one of the main tenets of the EU membership is the idea of free movement, which means that you don't need a visa to live in another country. And in fact, there is an area, a group of countries known as, I believe, the Schengen area, and they have abolished passport controls at their border, which essentially translates to you don't need a passport to travel between these countries. So that was something that the pro-leavers are really worried about. And ultimately, what I'm not surprised to hear a lot of older voters are really worried about. So now we look to people who want to stay. And on the other hand, David Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK, which, can I say I'm super surprised he wanted to stay? He wanted Britain to stay. He even sought an agreement with other EU leaders to change the terms of Britain's membership so that he could appease British citizens who didn't like the current agreement while avoiding having to actually leave. He was backed by 16 members of his cabinet, the Labour Party, SNP, Plaid Cymru. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's spelled Cymru, and I think it looks probably Welsh. I don't know. He was also backed by the Liberal Democrats. On a more informal note, he was also backed by Barack Obama and several other EU nations, including France and Germany, who all wanted the UK to remain in the EU. And those who wanted to stay say that they believe the country gets a really big boost from membership because it makes trade with other EU countries easier, as does the flow of immigrants, the majority of whom are young and move to the UK looking for work. And this ultimately fuels economic growth in the UK, and it also helps to pay for public services. I think one of the most notable reasons, though, is that leaving the EU meant that Britain's international reputation would be severely damaged, and there is more security in remaining a member of the Union rather than standing alone, for obvious reasons, considering most of Britain's surrounding countries are all members of the European Union. So now that we know what the European Union is and what each side wanted, why and how did that decision to leave affect youth? And why did so many of them vote to stay? And there are some really predictable major reasons. The first, however, involves a program called Erasmus. Officially known as the European Region Action Scheme for the Mobility of University Students, it is essentially an EU-sponsored student exchange program that was established in 1987. And it's the grandfather of a new program that was established in January 2014 called Erasmus+, which essentially kind of throws in all of the EU's current schemes for education, training, youth, and athletics. Currently, there are more than 4,000 higher institutions across 33 countries participating, and since the program's inception, nearly 3 million students have participated. And I believe as of now, 200,000 students from the UK have participated, so that's a lot of people. The Erasmus experience among most European youth is considered a chance to learn, to socialize, and travel for the youth who are accepted into the program, with the main part being that students are not required to pay extra tuition fees to the university that they visit, notably international student fees, which if you're an international student or you've ever been one, you know that those fees are really, really high sometimes. Students who are accepted into the program can apply for an Erasmus grant that will help cover the costs of living abroad, and disabled students are also able to apply for an additional grant that will help them cover expenses related to their disability. It's really popular among European students because this is often their first chance to live and study in another country. So what exactly does Brexit mean for the students who are currently part of this fabulous program? Basically, it will restrict their movement across borders. Like I said before, around 200,000 UK students are participating, which is really important because A, that's a lot of people, and B, undergraduate students in England have the highest tuition fees in the world, and I believe their tuition averages around £6,000 a year. I don't know the exchange rate right now between that and the Canadian dollar, but I imagine it's quite a bit. Brexit essentially makes it more difficult for those wanting to study abroad to obtain visas, and it also hikes up the associated fees. Essentially, being part of the EU meant that students in the UK didn't have to pay international student fees, and now they do. So that really sucks. Brexit also means that young people who immigrate to the UK, and consequently UK youth who immigrate to other countries and want to work in other countries, now all need to obtain visas as well. This impacts their ability to gain meaningful employment because a lot of employers don't want to hire people with work visas because obviously they're going to have to leave at some point, and employers also have to sponsor these people as far as I understand. Because many economists and others have warned that leaving the EU could trigger a recession, which it obviously has, considering the lowering of the value of the British pound and the subsequent inflation. This makes it even harder for UK youth to find jobs domestically. And as history and sociology and economics have shown, whenever there's a recession, young people and the lowest skilled are often hit the hardest. And this is across the board. It doesn't matter where you live. This is true. Pro-leavers have argued that a drop in immigration would make it easier for young people to find work, as they do here at home. But on a national level, this doesn't always apply, because with the drop in immigration means a drop in the economy, because they don't have those immigrants contributing to the economy anymore. And immigrants often contribute more to the economy than they take from it. So essentially, the economy is poor and nobody wants to hire young kids. Housing is also a really big area that is going to be affected. Pro-leavers often argued that leaving the European Union meant that the limits on immigration would lower housing prices, because the heightened housing prices were blamed on immigrants who lived in the UK. and supposedly leaving would make it easier for youth to be able to buy their first homes. Leaving the European Union with those consequences for the economy, when an economy is in a really, really low place, credit companies often will heighten the requirements that you need to meet before you can get a loan, and this includes a mortgage. So essentially, because the economy is now crap, it means that young people who want to buy a house might not necessarily be able to because they might not meet the new credit limits that are being put in place. And as I already said, the decline in the British pound means that inflation is raised, which ultimately will lead to a higher cost of living. And in fact, inflation and the effect that the leaving will have on the economy has been said to be a major reason why a lot of young people voted to remain in the Union. So now that we all know that, what do people think about it? As someone who is not a British citizen or a member, a citizen of a EU member country, I wasn't really interested in this story at first, and when I took the pitch up for it, I thought it would be an interesting thing to look up because I want to become more familiar with politics. One of my summer resolutions is to not be so boring, and I figured, learning more about politics and international politics would be a good start. I was actually blown away at the huge generational divide in votership because, once again, as a young person, I feel for my peers because I know what it's like to be in a position where we want our voices to be heard, but we're often discouraged from getting out there and being heard. And something that a lot of UK Census Office statistics have shown is that the votership among youth for this particular referendum was very, very low, despite the fact that their votes were overwhelmingly in favor of staying. I think this really showed why it's so important for young people to get out and vote and to participate in politics and become more informed, because even if you think something doesn't affect you, it ultimately does. And that's especially true for students who are living abroad who now have to figure out how they're going to stay in school or if they're ultimately going to have to leave. It's also interesting when you consider the fact that the day after the referendum was passed, Google reported an overwhelming uptick in searches for what is the European Union. And I'm not sure what the demographics were on that, but the news story that I was following essentially said that it looked as if people who had voted to leave the European Union didn't really know what they were leaving for. And I think that's a really strong reminder that it's really important to be informed and to be aware of what it exactly is you're voting for. And that, someone might have your best interests at heart, but they actually don't. And that's really important when you consider the fact that there were so many parties that were backing staying in the Union, yet the party that won the election wanted to leave. And it begs the question of, did they win because they promised that they would try and get this referendum passed? I don't know if they did, so if you know, please let me know. But I think, like I said, it really shows how important it is that you be informed and you know what you're voting for. Because if you don't know what you're voting for, I think you probably won't even realize what the consequences of your vote mean. And that's especially interesting because this also affects older British people, older members of the UK, who own property abroad, because now they're probably going to have to pay more taxes. There's more living expenses involved now that they're not a member of the European Union. And it's essentially just a big mess for everybody who is involved. So I really learned a lot by researching this article and this video, because it was definitely a reminder for me that I need to be more informed, and that people my age also need to be more informed, and they also need to be more involved. So that's my video for this week. If you have any questions for me, feel free to tweet at FlirtMag. You can also visit our website. Our summer issue will be out soon, so I'm really excited for that because I actually wrote something in there. Yay! So make sure you check that out. I will tweet out a link when it is released. And I hope you all are having a wonderful weekend. I will see you next week.